Thank you, guys. So before I start every talk, I like to understand you a little bit. So I have a few questions. First of all, who in this room has ever tried VR? All right. Who in this room creates VR content? Who in this room creates the technology that makes VR possible? All right, a couple of people. Who in this room is an educator? All right, a good number, half maybe. Who in this room is currently a student? A few. And who in this room currently loves someone who is in the educational system? Most of us. Okay, so I know a little bit about you. I will do my best to make my talk relevant to your interests. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I am that third category in the first set of questions. I work on creating the technology that makes VR possible and investigating a lot of the design issues that really stymie people or give them a really superb experience. So that's a lot of what we'll discuss today. I'm not a traditional technologist, although I'm currently a VP at a San Francisco tech company. I grew up on a rural ranch in West Texas, taking care of horses and cattle. I was not the typical computer nerd kid. I couldn't sit still. I was the kid that was always moving in class. And my wonderful parents, you can always blame things on your parents, of course. I say that it's because they founded a Montessori school. And if you are at all familiar with Montessori, you know that the basic edict of the Montessori educational philosophy is, I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. So I took that preference for kinesthetic learning with me into a career in dance as a professional dancer and choreographer, and almost into a career in medicine because I was fascinated by the brain-body binary. I always found it incredibly frustrating that our society in general tends to try and divorce the two, as if being in your body will make you less capable of being in your mind. They're the same thing. And I found in my life that I was much more effective when I was able to wed the two. And so I'm very excited about the possibilities of what I call spatial computing, the arena of computing that is emerging where computing suddenly is released from its little boxes and is spread across the world for us to interact with it, and is actually something that we can engage on the body level as opposed to with clicks and pecking. So we'll discuss that today. And first I want to give you a little bit of context around what I see as the huge opportunity of spatial computing by talking about embodied cognition. So we used to think of cognition in a very mechanistic way. The brain and the world, I think, therefore I am. Now we understand that cognition is actually mediated through the body. So essentially, we now know, all cognitive scientists, what dancers know, that thought is physicalized, and that we use our bodies to offload storage and simplify cognition. Has anyone ever crossed their fingers to remember anything? If you've done that, you have utilized embodied cognition to offload storage and simplify cognition. So we then continue to interrogate the nature of cognition and understand that cognition is not only embodied, it's also inactive, meaning that thought is actually mediated by our actions. This is a fascinating field that most people are still not very aware of. And one study that I'll share with you, which will affect everyone in this room, is that as you lose your ability to move around the world, you also lose your episodic memory. The two are linked. The more motion you have, the more ability you have to remember your personalized experiences. And there have been some really fascinating studies done on this in VR, where elderly groups of people are asked to navigate a city in VR, either through simulation or through a directed experience. Those who direct their own experience, who control their own motion in the space, even as a simulation, remember much more of the details of their experience. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening with VR in the nature of embodied and inactive cognition. And I'm actually going to post a lot of the speeches that I'll reference, or not speeches, they're scientific studies, essentially research papers, onto my Twitter. So if anyone wants to see the sources, this is my Twitter and you can check it out there later. So here, Edgar Dale, an Americanist educator who was born around 1900, reiterated what we know from Maria Montessori. We remember about 10% of what we hear, or 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, and 30% of what we see. So why do we base so much of our education on reading? Seems a little strange. Well, the answer is because it scales well. The printing press, massive revolution in human knowledge systems. We can scale knowledge that way. But what if we could scale something else. A study from Columbia University described how students who are able to manipulate an anatomical structure in VR remember and learn much more quickly than if they can just view the anatomical structure in VR. So again, the emphasis on inactive cognition, the ability to manipulate and engage the topic of your interest. So that's what I work on. I work at a company called Leap Motion, and at Leap Motion, we do something that is simple but deeply complex, one of the hardest problems in human-computer interaction today. We replicate with absolute precision, well, with precision, the movements of your hands and fingers, not just your fingertips, but your hand. And we do that, I'll just give you a brief overview for those who are techie geeks in the room, with infrared light. So essentially, imagine two little infrared flashlights on our module. They shine infrared light onto your hands, and then there are two little cameras. You can see one here, that blue eye right there. And that camera sees the infrared light, 860 nanometer wavelength, on your hands, extracts the position of 26 points on your hand and arms, pipes that data through our API, and renders your hand in the digital world so that you become present. So that you literally have digital hands without having to wear a glove, without having to wear rings, just by showing up. And that makes you able to do things like this. To interact in the digital world just as you would in the real world. The reason I think this is so important is because to me, the core value add of virtual reality is in a sense of presence. The magic of VR is in presence, feeling fully present in a world that is other than the world you currently exist inside. That enables empathy, learning, healing, a lot of fascinating use cases. And this capacity to project your physical self into a different version of yourself is something we've known about for decades. We started studying it when veterans came home from war missing limbs and were experiencing phantom limb pain. We would put a mirror in the table and reflect their functional limb over to the missing limb side so that they could unclench their functional hand and trick their brain into thinking that their phantom limb was suddenly releasing its pain. It's amazing how we can trick the human brain and actually heal people with these sort of simulations. So this is simply a more advanced interrogation into something we've been studying for a very long time. Another thing that I think is very fascinating about this technology for the purposes of education is that it occurs through feedback loops, which is actually how we learn. We don't learn through taking information, being tested on it, and regurgitating it. We learn through play. We learn through iteration and mistakes and opportunity and discovery. And that is what happens when you place someone in a world as opposed to a structured test environment. So you're familiar with the evolution of technology. Right now we're in the wired and mobile phase, and we'll be moving increasingly towards mixed reality. But I always ask myself, where does this become useful? Because I do have that inner West Texan in me, and no one that I love, that I grew up with, knows anything about this or cares about it at all, unless it solves a real human problem. So what is VR good for? If you're in this room wanting to create virtual reality content, what kind of things are you gonna make? I'd say there are 4 important domains to think about: the dangerous, the impossible, the counterproductive, and the expensive. The dangerous. Imagine being a professional boxer or football player and needing to train, but having to deal with the danger of being concussed before the big game. It would be very useful to be able to train your synapses and your body in space without the threat of harm. The counterproductive. This one is fascinating to me. The Stanford Virtual Reality Lab has done some really interesting studies where they put people in this amazing virtual world of trees and butterflies and caterpillars and give them a chainsaw, and they have them cut down the entire forest, nothing else. People use less paper. Strange. You would never have someone cut down an entire forest to make them use less paper in real life because the ROI just wouldn't line up, but you can do that in the virtual world. So counterproductive use cases are really interesting there. The expensive, flying someone to space to train them in a weightless environment, having people operate really expensive heavy machinery before they know how. You can simulate those things in VR, and it's a perfect training ground. And finally, the impossible, my personal favorite, projecting someone into a body that is not their own. So again, Stanford Virtual Reality Lab has done some explorations into empathy building and essentially They'll put you in a world, you'll see your avatar in a window, it looks like you, so if it looks like me, it's 5'4", and it's got brown hair, and I jump, and the avatar jumps, and I raise my arm, and the avatar raises its arm, body transfer. Just like mirror therapy, just like we were discussing with hand presence. Then you walk around the room, and you come back around, and suddenly I'm a 50-year-old African-American man. And I jump, and he jumps, and I raise my arm, and he raises his arm. And you start to project yourself into that body. And you actually experience the world differently when you're inside a different body. That's not something we really get to explore here, but it is something we get to explore in virtual reality. So for example, there's a group who are using Leap Motion to explore the experience of losing your vision and your hearing as an elderly person. You put on the headset and you can simulate that experience, and I now understand my grandmother's world much better. She's experiencing macular degeneration. I didn't have a reference point for that until I tried that experience. So again, the dangerous, the expensive, the counterproductive, and the impossible. So what are we doing at Leap Motion? We're asking this question: what are hands uniquely suited to? So here are some examples. First, you can physicalize the abstract. You can learn things like the movement of tectonic plates by moving them with your hands and watching how they interact. Imagine being a 5th grader learning about geology that way. And the National Science Foundation actually created this, and it resulted in a 30% learning retention increase. A full sense of immersion, we've discussed this quite a bit. This is Lyra VR, which allows you to jump inside a musical composition and experience a 3-dimensional orchestra. Social experiences, which allow for the expression of gesture and connection with other people in virtual spaces across very distant geographies. This is a party in AltSpace VR. And then access to learning, education, information. Imagine being able to scale the education around dissecting cadavers. Cadavers are very expensive assets, and as soon as you cut into them, they're no longer useful for other medical students. What if you could scale that resource and bring access to that education to parts of the world that don't even have the resources to bring in cadavers to train their medical staff? So this is a quote from one of our developers, but in the interest of time, I'll move forward. But it's important to look at some of the core challenges, which are also there. There are many categories. We'll group them for you all: the physical, the emotional, and the systemic. I want to raise some of these because there are a lot of smart minds in this room, and it's up to all of us to help define these spaces, to interrogate these important questions. So in the physical sense, of course, you have situations like nausea or eye strain that you have to account for, but also things like brain development and gene expression. What is the effect on children's brains if we start using this in education? We don't have studies about that yet. We should. Emotional. We have well-documented examples of people confronting trauma and fear. What are the parameters of that? How do you gauge that for each individual? And what is the tension between isolation and connection in these experiences? Because they can provide for both. It's a design question. What are you designing for? And then systemic safety questions, like the usage of data. No other medium has the ability to understand users' behaviors, emotions, impressions the way VR does, because you're collecting all this sensory data, potentially. And then also, how do we define children's rights, especially if we're using this in virtual environments for classrooms? So finally, I want to end with the thoughts from one of my favorite thinkers, Buckminster Fuller, who reminds us that if we want to teach people new ways of thinking, don't try to teach them anything. Give them a tool, the use of which will lead to new ways of thinking. And I think that virtual and augmented reality are those kinds of tools. So I'm going to give you an example. So I want you to think about what it would be like to understand the world physically, not just abstractly. And you know this from playing basketball, right? You know this from throwing balls. They arc in parabolas. You've got a physical understanding of that. You don't have to know the equation. You understand this in some fundamental level. Imagine if you could code quantum physics in VR. Amazing. If kids could actually play with quantum particles or the solar system to understand physics that currently are only accessible through abstract thinking. So here's a version of this that I'm going to give you all. This is a self-portrait. Here you are. This is Earthrise, taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968, depicting our world. Here is another depiction of our world, which many of you may have seen in schools. Here is what's actually going on. This is from 1975. Reality is spiroorbital. All terrestrial critical path developments inherently orbit the sun. No path can be linear. All paths are precessionally modulated by remotely operative forces producing spirolinear paths. Everyone got that, right? Okay, so let me show you what I mean. This is where you live. This is your self-portrait. This is the kind of insight that a tool, a three-dimensional tool, and a learning tool like augmented and virtual reality can create. Thank you guys very much.